Hello, my name is John for Through the Eyes of George, and today I'd like to talk to you about Mount Vernon and why it is so important in today's culture. But first, I'd like to say that at no time have I ever received financial sponsorship from anybody or any organization. I do this because I love history and I love learning about the source and the key figure in American history, which is George Washington. To start out, I'd like to say that George Washington received the inheritance of Mount Vernon through the Washington family. Augustus Washington, his father, passed it to George's half-brother Lawrence. When Lawrence passed away, it eventually got to George Washington. Lawrence received Mount Vernon in 1743. Now, George Washington was born in the early 1700s. Now, Lawrence Washington named Mount Vernon after his British admiral in the Navy, or his British commander in the Navy, Edward Vernon. That's where Mount Vernon gets its name. Now, I'm very sorry. George Washington loved Mount Vernon, and there are several letters where he talks about how much he loves Mount Vernon. I will read excerpts from two of them. One of them is from George Washington to his beloved wife, Martha Washington, on June 18th, 1775. George Washington says, "You may believe me, my dear Patsy." Patsy is a nickname that George Washington, a nickname that he gave to Martha. "When I assure you in the most solemn manner that so far from seeking this appointment, I have used every endeavor in my power to avoid it, not only from my unwillingness to part with you and the family, but from a consciousness of its being a trust too great for my capacity, and that I should enjoy more real happiness and felicity in 1 month with you at home," talking about Mount Vernon, "than I have the most distant prospect of reaping abroad." The next excerpt I'd like to talk about is from April 5th, 1783, when George Washington wrote a letter to one of his best friends, most trusted confidants. Very sorry, heartburn. Very sorry. Anyway, one of his best friends and trusted confidants, Marquis de Lafayette. And in that he wrote essentially that he cannot wait to see Marquis in America and to be with him at Mount Vernon. Your most obedient and faithful friend, George Washington. There is also a portrait, a painting made of Marquis de Lafayette and George Washington, his family, on the back piazza, or the back porch, you could say, of Mount Vernon that's facing the Potomac River. I'll put that in the video at the very end. Now, like I said, there are many correspondence of how much George Washington loved Mount Vernon. We're not going to get into that. But George Washington leaves Mount Vernon in his will to Bushrod Washington. And Bushrod leaves it to John Augustine Washington, who was brothers with Corbin and Hannah Lee Washington. And after John Augustine, it goes to John Augustine Jr., which is very important. We'll get into that later. Now, with the preservation of Mount Vernon and the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, somebody could not even talk about this without even mentioning Edward Everett. Without Mr. Everett, the notoriety and the public knowing about how important Mount Vernon is at the time and that we need to preserve it couldn't be done without, first and foremost, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, but also with the help of Edward Everett. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association was formed in 1853, and it couldn't be done without the efforts of Anne Pamela Cunningham, who lived from 1816 to 1875. In 1860, the Mount Vernon Ladies Association bought the estate for $200,000 and the 200,000 acres surrounding Mount Vernon. In 1861, there was a declaration made by a Civil War general for neutral territory of Mount Vernon, and through the Civil War, many Union and Confederate soldiers visited Mount Vernon to give homage and memory towards our first president, George Washington. In 1916, Thomas Edison installed the first electricity, or I guess you could say first electrical system in Mount Vernon. In 1979 to 1982, around 1982, the interior of Mount Vernon received its first coat of paint, or its first painting, or however you want to say that, to its original 1790 paint coating. And most importantly, in our time and culture of what we're going to get into, in 2006, the Ford Orientation Center, the Education Center, and the Donald W. Reynolds Center opened in 2006, which is pivotal to the education, in my personal opinion, of an avid lover of history, of American history, to the preservation of Mount Vernon. And the preservation of Mount Vernon, why it's so important in today's culture, is because it preserves the sanctuary in which George Washington lived, in which he could be himself in all the facets of being yourself, whether it's the 1700s or 2020. He could be himself on his estate with his most trusted companion, Martha, and everyone who lived there. Now, there are a couple books I'll put in the description below that give more and greater detail about what it was like at Mount Vernon. One of the best books to pick up about that is this book right here, the 2017 George Washington's Mount Vernon Official Guidebook. I'll put all of that in the description below, as well, and other books that describe what it was like at Mount Vernon in the 1700s and while George Washington lived there. Now, why I say this thing about George Washington's Mount Vernon being a sanctuary, because at Mount Vernon, one of the places where George Washington wrote a lot of letters and correspondence before, after, and during him being president was his study, which in great detail this book here goes into it, or you can go onto mountvernon.org. There is the distillery, there's the smokehouse, there's the wharf, there is the enslaved community memorial at Mount Vernon. There's also the grist mill, I believe that's how you say it, the grist mill. And there's the kitchen, there's the 5 gardens, there's a plethora of things that George Washington did, and he also built like physically on and expanded the size of the mansion through the years, that over 40 plus years that George Washington owned Mount Vernon. So another thing I'd like to say is that without the efforts of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association and the preservation of what it was like to live in the 1700s, the good, the bad, and the indifferent, and the things we can glean and learn, and what George Washington is known for, and changing your mind for the better in many things that George Washington did in his life, with whether it's politics or history or whatever it may be. George Washington did change his mind on a lot of things, but Mount Vernon was a place where he could decompress, where he could express his love for the hobbies and farming, and he did some surveying in the area, and he just loved being there. And to close this video, I will read an excerpt from one of my favorite books about Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon is Ours. This book here gives a fantastic overview, synopsis, history of the founding of Mount Vernon and the preservation of it. I'm very sorry for all of that, all the burping. Now, on page 442, this is an excerpt from the First Regent, Anne Pamela Cunningham, and I'm going to read a quote from her. And she says, ladies, this is to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association. Miss Cunningham is writing a letter, a note to them. Ladies, the home of our Washington is in your charge. See to it that you keep it the home of Washington. Let no irreverent hand change it. No vandal hands desecrate with the fingers of progress those who go to the home in which he lived and died, George Washington lived and died, wish to see in what he lived and died. Let one spot in this grand country of ours be saved from change. Upon you rests this duty. This is a great book about the history of the preservation of Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon is ours. So if you'd like to know more about Mount Vernon and the complete history of it, I highly suggest you either pick up this book here, the official guidebook to George Washington's Mount Vernon, the 2017 edition, or go to mountvernon.org. Thank you for watching this video. I'll put all my sources for this in the description below. And thank you for watching this. Don't forget to click subscribe, click the notification bell, or give it a thumbs up. And yeah, you're the best, and have a great day.